What would you do if, on the very night your husband threw you out into the freezing rain for being unable to give him a child, the most feared man in the city stepped out of the shadows, offered you his hand, and said only two words, "Come with me"? The door had just slammed behind her. A single suitcase sat open on the wet pavement, her entire life reduced to what she could carry in the rain. And when she looked up, blinking through the water and the ruin, a man built from stillness and menace was watching her as though she were the only thing worth seeing on the whole dark street. This is a story of cruelty and hidden worth, of a discarded woman and a dangerous man, and of the night that everyone's contempt finally, catastrophically backfired. Elena Marsh had spent 7 years learning how to make herself smaller. She had once been someone. Before the marriage, she had been Dr. Elena Marsh, a brilliant clinical toxicologist, the youngest specialist her hospital had ever hired, a woman whose mind could read a dying body like a page and name the invisible poison killing it. Then she had fallen in love with Bennett Cole, a charming, ambitious man from an old money family, and he had asked her, sweetly at first, to give it all up. A wife of the Cole family does not work, he had said. She should devote herself to the home, to the children. So Elena had folded away her career, her confidence, and eventually her own name, and she had waited for the children that never came. Month after month, year after year, her body refused to do the one thing the Cole family had decided was her entire purpose. Bennett grew cold. His mother grew cruel. And Elena, once a woman who had saved lives with a glance at a blood panel, learned to shrink under a roof full of people who told her, in 1,000 quiet ways, that she was broken, useless, an empty vessel taking up space that a real wife should occupy. The cruelty was never loud. It lived in the small things, the way Bennett's mother would set a fertility clinic's pamphlet beside Elena's breakfast plate, the way conversations died the moment she entered a room, the way Bennett began coming home late smelling of another woman's perfume and daring her, with his eyes, to say a single word. Elena had once diagnosed a rare poisoning from nothing but the tremor in a stranger's little finger. Now she could not summon the courage to ask her own husband where he had been. She had traded a scalpel for a wedding ring, and the trade had hollowed her out so slowly that she did not notice until there was almost nothing left of the brilliant woman she had been. She stopped speaking at dinners. She stopped meeting her own eyes in the mirror. She apologized for existing. And on the night everything ended, Bennett did not even do her the courtesy of privacy. He did it at his mother's anniversary gala, in front of the entire family, in front of the woman he had already chosen to replace her. Elena had no idea that across the crowded ballroom, a man the whole city feared had been watching her all evening, and had already decided that her husband was about to make the single greatest mistake of his life. Bennett Cole did it the way cruel men do things, wrapped in a smile. He raised his champagne flute in the middle of his mother's gala, called for the room's attention, and announced that after 7 barren years he had finally found the future of the Cole line. He gestured to a slender, glittering young woman named Sabrina, who laid a manicured hand over her stomach with a triumphant little smile, and the room understood at once. Elena stood frozen near the marble pillar, her wine-colored gown suddenly feeling like a costume, as 100 powerful people turned to stare at the wife who could not give her husband a child. "You understand, Elena," Bennett said, loud enough to carry, his voice dripping false regret. "A man in my position needs an heir. You had your chance. Sabrina gave me a real one." His mother, seated like a queen, added the final blade. "Be grateful he kept you as long as he did. Now be a dear and don't make a scene on your way out." The cruelty of it struck Elena like a physical blow, and for one paralyzing second she was every humiliated version of herself she had ever been. But she did not scream. She did not faint. She did not beg. She set down her untouched glass, lifted her chin though her whole world was collapsing, and walked out of that ballroom with her spine straight, refusing to give them the tears they were hungry for. A servant had already set her single-packed suitcase by the door, as though her exile had been arranged hours in advance. She stepped out into a cold, driving rain, and the great doors of the Cole estate closed behind her with a sound like a coffin. She stood on the pavement, soaked in seconds, 7 years of her life reduced to one bag, and finally, alone in the dark, she allowed a single tear to fall. The rain soaked through her thin gown in seconds, plastering her hair to her face, and for a long moment, she simply stood there, too hollow even to move, listening to the muffled music and laughter of the party that had just discarded her leaking through the great doors. 7 years of swallowing her voice, of folding away everything she had ever been. And this was the receipt they handed her, a suitcase in the rain and a servant who would not meet her eyes. And that was when the temperature of the whole night seemed to shift, when a low, unhurried voice spoke from the shadows of a waiting black car. "You are shaking," it said. Elena turned. A man had stepped out of the darkness, tall and broad and impossibly still, dressed in a charcoal coat that the rain seemed afraid to touch. She knew his face. Everyone in the city knew his face, the way they knew the face of something dangerous. Alessandro Ferro was the head of a syndicate that owned the ports, the docks, and the fear of every powerful man for 100 miles, a figure spoken of in lowered voices, a man rumored to end lives with a single nod. And he was looking at her, a discarded woman crying in the rain, with an intensity that had nothing to do with pity. Elena had met him once before, though he was not supposed to remember. 2 years earlier, on a night she still wore a white coat and answered to doctor, a man had been rushed into her emergency room convulsing and gray, his organs shutting down, while 3 physicians argued uselessly over the cause. Elena had taken one look at his pupils, one breath of the bitter almond note clinging to his skin, one glance at the arrhythmia crawling across the monitor, and named the rare toxin in 90 seconds flat, and then she had pulled him back from the edge of death with her own hands while everyone else stood frozen. In the corner of that trauma bay had stood a tall, terrifyingly calm man in a charcoal coat, the dying man's employer, who had watched her work with an intensity that unnerved her, and who, when it was over, had looked at her as though he were quietly filing her away for a future she could not yet imagine. That employer had been Alessandro Ferro, and he had never once forgotten the doctor who saw what everyone else missed. Now he stepped closer, unhurried, ignoring the rain entirely, and shrugged off his heavy charcoal coat. Without a word, he draped it over Elena's trembling shoulders, enveloping her in warmth and the scent of cedar and something darker underneath, and the sheer gentleness of the gesture nearly broke her more than all Bennett's cruelty had. "They threw you into the rain," he said quietly, and it was not a question. "They threw away the sharpest mind I have ever watched work, because a fool decided your worth was measured by a thing your body would not do." He held out his hand, his palm open, rain sliding off his knuckles. "Come with me, Elena, not as anyone's possession. As the only person in this city I would trust with my life." She stared at that open hand, at the man the whole world feared offering it to the woman the whole world had discarded, and something in Elena that had been bending for 7 years finally straightened. She did not know what she was walking into. She only knew she was done being thrown away. She placed her cold, trembling hand in his, and Alessandro closed his warm fingers around it like a promise, and the black car swallowed them both into the rain. She had lost everything that night. She had no idea she had just been handed a kingdom. Alessandro's estate was a fortress of stone and glass above the water, and Elena, who had spent 7 years shrinking, braced herself for a new cage with a more dangerous jailer. Instead, something impossible began to happen. He gave her a wing of her own, a wardrobe, a locked medical study stocked with everything a toxicologist could dream of, and, more than any of it, he gave her something she had not felt in years. He gave her respect. He did not touch her, did not demand, did not so much as raise his voice. He simply began, quietly, to treat her as though her mind were the most valuable thing in his violent world. He brought her problems no one else could solve, a rival's suspicious death, a shipment tainted by something no lab could name, and he watched her come alive as she worked, watched the shrinking woman from the rain straighten into the brilliant doctor she had buried. "You were made for this," he told her one night, watching her identify a compound 3 of his people had missed. "Do not ever apologize for taking up a room again." Elena felt the ice around her chest begin, slowly, to crack. It became a ritual. Night after night, she found herself across a table from the most feared man in the city, a decanter of amber whiskey between them, untangling the poisons and puzzles of his violent world, and night after night, he told her things he had never told another living soul, about the father he had buried and the trust he had learned to bury with him. He never pushed. He never demanded. He simply poured her a glass and listened as though her voice were the only sound worth hearing. And slowly the woman who had apologized for existing began, again, to speak. One night, when a difficult case kept them both awake until the tall windows went gray with dawn, he walked her to her door and paused, and his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and Elena thought he might kiss her. Instead, he only looked at her, memorizing her face, and murmured good night, and left her standing there with her heart pounding like a girl's, terrified of how much she had begun to want a man the whole world feared. But the world beyond the fortress walls had not forgotten her humiliation and cruelty, it turned out, was not finished. A month after Alessandro took her in, the city's elite gathered for a charity gala, and he did the one thing that stunned his entire organization. He brought Elena on his arm, draped in a gown of deep midnight silk, and walked her into a room full of the very people who had watched her cast out. Bennett was there. So was Sabrina, her pregnancy now a visible, glittering trophy. And the moment they saw Elena beside the most feared man in the city, their smug faces curdled. Sabrina recovered first, her voice a poisoned trill as she looked Elena over. "Oh, Elena, sweetheart," she cooed, loud enough to draw a crowd. "Did you really trade up, or did he simply need a charity case? Careful, Mr. Farrow," she added with a cruel little laugh, "she's damaged goods. She can't even give a man a child." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. A ripple of cruel laughter began, and for a heartbeat the old shame rose in Elena's throat. But before she could shrink, Alessandro was there, sliding an arm around her waist, pressing a glass of amber whiskey into her hand to steady her. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Sabrina, then at Bennett, the way a man looks at something scraped off his shoe. "This woman," he said, his voice soft, silken, and absolutely lethal, "has more worth in a single thought than the two of you will possess in your entire lives. You measured her by an accident of biology and threw away a genius." His dead gaze settled on Bennett. "I have looked into your finances, Mr. Cole. Your family's fortune has been quietly failing for years, and it was your discarded wife's careful management that hid it. Without her, you will be bankrupt inside 18 months. The crowd went utterly silent. Bennett went pale. Alessandro bent his head to Elena's ear, his voice for her alone. "You never stand in a room like this afraid again, Joya," he murmured, using the soft endearment for the first time, the word for joy. "Not in my world, and never in front of me." And Elena, the whiskey warm in her hand and his arms solid at her back, felt the last of her smallness begin to burn away. But across that same ballroom, a man who had smiled at Alessandro for 20 years was watching them with cold, calculating eyes, and quietly deciding that the doctor from the rain had just become the most inconvenient obstacle in the city. The man with the cold eyes was Fabian, Alessandro's consigliere, the silver-tongued second who had served the family since Alessandro was a boy. Fabian had spent 2 patient years executing the perfect crime. He had been poisoning Alessandro for months, a slow, exquisite toxin folded into the rare cigars only the boss smoked, a compound designed to mimic a failing heart, untraceable by any ordinary physician, calibrated to kill by inches so that when Alessandro finally collapsed, the whole world would call it natural. In another few weeks the empire would have fallen to Fabian without a single suspicious drop of blood. And then Alessandro had brought home a clinical toxicologist, the one kind of person alive who could read the invisible thing killing him. Fabian smiled and began, very quietly, to move up his timeline. He had access, patience, and 2 decades of the boss's absolute trust, and he intended to spend all 3 before the doctor could ruin everything. The soft, discarded woman from the rain, he was certain, would be the easiest thread to cut. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Elena noticed it before anyone else, because noticing was what she had been built to do. Over the following weeks, she watched Alessandro, this mountain of a man, grow subtly wrong. A gray tint beneath his olive skin, a tremor in his steady hands, a shortness of breath that his own doctors dismissed as stress and age. But Elena had spent her life reading dying bodies, and what she saw was not stress. It was a pattern, slow and deliberate and man-made. Late one rain-lashed night, she slipped into his study while he slept and took a sample of everything: his whiskey, his coffee, the humidor of imported cigars, and she carried it to her locked medical room and worked until dawn. And what she found turned her blood to ice. She sat alone in the cold blue light of her instruments as the dawn came up, staring at a result that meant the man who had pulled her out of the rain, the first person in years to look at her and see something worth saving, was being murdered slowly under his own roof, and that she was very likely the only human being alive with the knowledge to stop it. The cigars were saturated with a refined cardiac toxin, rare, expensive, and utterly deliberate. Someone inside the fortress, someone with access to the boss's most private possessions, was murdering him one breath at a time. She did not scream. She did not run to Alessandro in a panic. She thought, the way she always had under pressure, cold and clear. Whoever this was had the boss's absolute trust and the patience of a predator, and if she moved carelessly, they would simply kill her and finish the job. So Elena did something quietly brilliant. She began switching the poisoned cigars for identical harmless ones she prepared herself, halting the toxin's advance while she hunted for the hand behind it, watching, cataloging, narrowing the list of people with access down to one. Twice she nearly ran to Alessandro with the truth, and twice she stopped herself, because a toxicologist knows that panic kills faster than any poison. She needed proof no one could dismiss, and she needed to know exactly whose hand had touched the cigar box. So she watched the household the way she had once watched a failing patient, reading the tells, eliminating the innocent one by one, until only a single name remained, a name so close to the boss that speaking it aloud without evidence would have gotten her killed before breakfast. She did not know that Fabian had already noticed his poison had stopped working. She did not hear him realize that the doctor had found him out. She was in her medical study one night, bent over the evidence that would damn him, when the door clicked shut behind her, and she turned to find Fabian standing there, a small pistol in his hand and a cold smile on his face. "Clever girl," he said softly. Alessandro always did have a weakness for strays who see too much. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs, but her mind was already moving faster than her fear. "You have been poisoning him," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Cardiac glycoside, refined, folded into the cigars. Weeks more and everyone would have called it a bad heart. It was elegant. Fabian inclined his head, almost flattered. "And you unraveled it in a fortnight," he said. "A pity." He raised the pistol. Alessandro will be so grieved to lose his brilliant new doctor to a tragic accident, right before his own tragic heart gives out. 2 funerals in 1 month. Elena looked at the gun, then at the man, and did the one thing he never expected. She smiled. "You should check your own glass before you shoot me, Fabian," she said, "because I have known it was you for 6 days, and I am not a woman who waits to be rescued." Fabian's cold smile flickered. He did not understand, not yet, that the toxicologist he had cornered was never unarmed, that she had spent her whole life turning invisible things into weapons, and that the trap he thought he was closing had already, silently, closed around him. Fabian's certainty lasted exactly as long as it took the poison to reach his own blood. 6 days earlier, the moment Elena had confirmed the traitor moved through the study, she had done what a toxicologist does. She had treated the crystal decanter of aged brandy that only Fabian, of all Alessandro's men, was permitted to drink, lacing it with a fast, non-lethal sedative of her own design, betting on the arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable. He had poured himself a glass an hour ago, to steady his nerves for the murder. Now, as he leveled the pistol at her chest, his vision was already swimming, his hand already trembling, his careful aim already sliding off its mark. Elena watched the confusion dawn on his face, watched the gun dip as his knees buckled, and she stepped calmly aside as he crashed to the floor of her study, the pistol skittering harmlessly across the tile. "What did you?" he slurred, clawing at the rug. "Cardiac glycoside is not the only thing I know how to prepare," Elena said, kneeling just out of his reach, her voice cold and clear. "You are not going to die. That would be a mercy. You are going to be awake and aware and entirely helpless when your boss walks through that door." As if summoned, the study doors burst open. Alessandro had felt the wrongness in the house, had come looking for her, and he took in the scene in a single glance, his poisoned, weakened frame filling the doorway, his eyes moving from the traitor twitching on the floor to the woman standing calm above him. Time seemed to fracture. He crossed the room, and Elena caught him as a wave of dizziness took him, easing him into a chair, her hands already on his pulse, her doctor's voice steady and commanding. "Sit," she ordered. "Breathe slow. You have been poisoned for months, Alessandro, cardiac glycoside in the cigars, and it was him. I stopped it 2 weeks ago. You are going to be all right, because I am very good at my job." Alessandro stared up at the woman he had pulled from the rain. This genius the whole world had thrown away, who had walked into a fortress full of killers and quietly saved his life while his own men slept. His loyal Lieutenant Tomas appeared in the doorway with 2 armed men, taking in the collapsed consigliere, and the trap Fabian had spent 2 years building snapped shut around him instead. But Alessandro did not look at his traitor. He looked at Elena, and the lethal cold in his eyes dissolved into something raw and terrified and tender. He reached up, his large hand trembling, and cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking, his own poison forgotten. "He had a gun. Did he touch you? Look at me." "I am perfectly fine," Elena whispered, a wet laugh escaping her, her hands still steady on his racing pulse. "You are the one who has been dying for months, you impossible man, and you are worried about me." He caught her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his laboring heart. "Because I have buried an empire's worth of soldiers, Joya," he breathed, "and none of them ever mattered the way you do. You walked into my house a discarded woman, and you saved my life before I even knew it needed saving." He pressed his forehead to hers, his poisoned heart still hammering beneath her palm, and for the first time since grief had frozen him solid, the most feared man in the city simply let himself be held by the woman he had pulled from the rain. Fabian, the man who had smiled at Alessandro for 20 years while poisoning him by inches, learned the price of underestimating them before the month was out. Alessandro did not act in blind rage. Once Elena had stabilized him, once the toxin was flushed from his blood by treatments only she knew how to administer, he let her lay out the entire elegant crime before the commission, every poisoned cigar, every doctored ledger Fabian had hidden, every patient step of a 2-year murder. And when it was done, Elena looked at her recovering champion and did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So they did it her way. They stripped Fabian of every hidden asset, exposed his slow treason to the families he had hoped one day to rule, and let the very men he had schemed to command cast him out. He was left alive, disgraced, powerless, his name turned into a warning whispered across the underworld, a fate the old men agreed was far crueler than a quick and merciful bullet. And then there was Bennett. Elena had not gone looking for revenge on the man who threw her into the rain. She had simply, as she always did, paid attention. She had known for years a truth her husband had refused to hear, because a discarded wife had once been a brilliant doctor. 7 years of failed hope had never once been Elena's body. The fault had always been Bennett's. And when Sabrina's pregnancy advanced and a routine test revealed what Elena had long suspected, that the child Bennett was parading as his triumph could not possibly be his, the humiliation detonated in public, exactly where he had humiliated her. The great Collier, who had cast out his wife for being barren, was revealed to be the sterile one all along, raising another man's child, his family's failing fortune collapsing now that the quiet genius who had hidden the rot was gone. Sabrina left him within the week, taking her lawyers and her secrets with her. His mother, who had told Elena to be grateful, was reduced to quietly selling the estate where she had once presided like a queen. Elena did not gloat. She did not need to. She simply let the truth do what truth does. Months later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Elena stood on the terrace of the fortress that had become a home, no longer shrinking, no longer apologizing, dressed in rich color that celebrated the woman she had buried and dug back up. Alessandro, fully recovered, strong and steady again because of her, came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You gave them mercy they did not deserve," he murmured. "Mercy is its own kind of power," she said. "Besides, I would rather build than burn." He turned her gently in his arms, his dark eyes soft in a way the rest of the world would never see. "They told you that you were worthless, Joya," he said, "because your body would not do one thing." And then that same overlooked woman walked out of the rain and outsmarted the deadliest man in my organization and pulled me back from a grave I did not know I was standing in. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. You were never an empty vessel. You are the fullest, fiercest, most extraordinary life I have ever held. They were wrong about everything, and they will spend the rest of their small lives knowing it. Elena looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one and yet bowed, entirely, to her, and for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had been told her worth was a thing her body could not do, and she had proven the whole cruel world wrong, because she alone had ever offered him something real, and she had turned the night she lost everything into the night she finally, truly began. She had not needed to be given a child to matter. She had needed only one person, in the whole cold world, to look at her, see everything that everyone else had thrown away, and say the two simple words that changed her fate forever: come with me. If Elena and Alessandro's story of cruelty, hidden worth, and hard-won vindication moved you, if you cheered when the discarded woman rose from the rain to outsmart an empire and claim the fearsome man who saw her when no one else would, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that the person the world throws away is so often the one with the most power hidden inside. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Elena and Alessandro's story?